It's October. And you know what that means. Horror movies, ghost stories, and lots of candy. But here at the Double Hour channel, we go above and beyond for our favorite holiday, Christmas. And that's why every video in the month of October will be Halloween related some way or another. To amp up that Halloween feeling and create a bigger whiplash when November 1st comes around and everything is suddenly Christmas. In our first video to kick off this joyous celebration, we here at the Double Hour channel have decided to delve into the subgenre of a subgenre. Yes, something so obscure and niche that your typical beanie wearing, handlebar mustache hipster wouldn't even know. Well, I wouldn't go that far. It isn't something like black and white movies about pigeons with no dialogue. Instead, it's something we like to call action horror. Whether this classification for a movie is already in use is beyond me. We don't research our videos here. But what we do in fact do is watch lots and lots of movies that have guns, vampires, werewolves, full moons, statues of vampires holding guns, and wolves on the moon. Indeed, here at the Double Hour channel, we worked hard to bring you information regarding something so unimportant, something so trivial, but something that can radically change your life. You see, the action horror movie is actually disguised as other types of movies. But to understand that, I first have to explain the nuances and needless complications that come with classifying a movie or anything in general. In life, or when someone or a team of someones creates something, whether that be a television show, a short or feature-length film, or any piece of art for that matter, there is a desire among us to classify it immediately. A movie can still be in production and the adverts are already describing it as the next action blockbuster. Or a new television series can be on the air and critics are calling it the next gritty crime drama that you must watch. Is this necessarily a bad thing, however? We live in an information-driven age, and information can come from categorizing things and broadly understanding that thing with a simple tag. That is true, and for some things like medicine or food, that makes things much easier. This is a swelling reducing medicine, and I have swelling, so maybe I can get this one to help with my swelling. Or when you ask somebody what they want to eat and they say chicken, so you go to a place that sells chicken. Medicine and chicken, while not being directly related, unless you are a scientist trialing your new testicle enhancement pills on poultry, are still more than their tags. The medicine you grabbed may also have the ability to lower your fever, or the place you went to only serves chicken tenders. But for the most part, tags used in daily life serve as express ways to understand something, but can that be applied to something as art? Now, before anyone comments about my pretentiousness, I only meant to say that with the nuances found within art, if the same principle can be justifiably applied to a piece of art. If you were a musician that created a very experimental piece of music that heavily incorporated various flutes, only for that to be classified as a rap album, then how would you feel? Nothing against rap, of course. Chief Sosa, bang bang. The problem with labels is that they oversimplify far too much what that piece of art is. Granted, sometimes the label is spot on. Whoever calls the 27th Fast and Furious an action movie, I don't think they're going to be wrong. That is unless the series swerves into a drastically new lane and doesn't spin its wheels doing so, avoiding a crash and burn. I'll be here all month. So what then? Why this brief foray into categorization? Well, in truth, because that is the whole point of this video. I will be classifying movies by my own definition to demonstrate a subgenre that may or may not exist. What is the definition then? Simply put, if the show has a decent amount of action and is roughly somewhat vaguely horror-esque, then you can probably classify it as an action horror movie. Here are some examples to help you in determining if it's an action horror movie or not. Does the movie star a vampire hunter? Probably action horror. Does the movie have werewolves fighting vampires? Most likely an action horror movie. No, Twilight does not count. Does the movie have a demon hunter and demons to hunt? Then more likely than not, it's an action horror movie. You really have to get a feel for it before you start categorizing movies. Now that we understand, to the best of our abilities, what an action horror movie is, how about we look at some hand-picked examples to understand what makes these movies passable or absolute garbage. Just straight vomit on the dining table levels of trash. Because be warned, the lows are astronomical, but the peaks are just about okay. For my first example, let's start with the quintessential action horror movie, at least one of them. You see, these movies really tend to sway in two directions. Is there demons? In the case of 2003's Underworld, there isn't any demons, but instead there are vampires and werewolves, or lichens in the case of this movie. I pick Underworld first among the sea of movies that can be classified by my very scientific and extremely accurate classification system, it's almost a natural law. That's how good it is. Because it mixes the trench coat wearing gunmen and women that was very popular at the time because of the Matrix, and it mixes it in with vampires and werewolves in a very dark and rainy city. Now, pitting vampires and werewolves against each other is nothing new now, and not when Underworld came out. But the thing that is pivotal to understand, the Double Hour Channel school of thought, when it comes to classifying these movies, is that the movies need to have gunfights. This is such because if the vampires were hunting werewolves with swords and bows, then the movie would be classified as a dark fantasy movie instead of an action movie. It's interesting to think that one aspect of a movie could change its entire categorization, but I suppose the guns being present and prevalent would mean that the time in which the movie takes place is modern, thus undermining the fantasy tag. But when looking at a series like Vampire Hunter D, which mixes the fantastical with the futuristic, it doesn't make any sense. I'm getting sidetracked here. Let's retain our attention to Underworld. Underworld is an alright picture, all things considered, but it suffers from something that all middling action movies suffer from: pacing issues. Now, I'm not about to act as if I fully understand what pacing really means, but when watching Underworld, you can tell that the middle of the movie is very still. For lack of a better word, boring. That might be appropriate as well. This happens because the movie opens very strongly with an action scene, and afterwards you get to experience the new characters and visualize the status quo. But after the excitement of the first act, the second act is used for build-up, which is somewhat paid off with the climax in the third act. This story structure kinda works. Look at any great movie that cold opens with an action scene. Heat, The Dark Knight, the SpongeBob movie, etc. However, in Underworld, the movie just becomes tedious and a slog to get through after the initial kinetic opening. What Underworld does bring, though, is a vibe and an atmosphere. I think the kids call it aura nowadays. That is severely lacking in other movies. This part is veering into personal opinion, but the rainy cityscapes draped in the black of night with the moon shyly peering through the small breaks in the clouds hanging above our protagonist dressed in black leather is something that cannot be topped in terms of visual appeal. This is why I have labored to make this video to spread the visual style of Batman, the good ones, but to be applied in other movies. No disrespect to Batman, but I just want something or someone who isn't dressed as an animal. Underworld isn't the only essential action horror movie in my opinion, the other being an adaptation of the Hellblazer comic, Constantine. Refer back to the question of, does this have demons? Constantine does have demons, angels, heaven and hell, all that jazz. You have to remember that action horror, or horror that isn't cosmic, slasher, supernatural, existential, internal, or basically anything that doesn't have to do with Catholic themes, falls into one camp, while anything that has any reference to Catholicism is in the other camp. This broadly applies to all sorts of media as well. I guess since it's the largest religion in the world, it makes for its appearance in media more prevalent. Constantine follows Constantine as he investigates a murder of a twin sister which may harbor something more sinister. In terms of movies, Constantine is a fun time. It flows nicely, doesn't become the slogfest that Underworld becomes, and overall is a very nice time. So much so that the movie has a pretty big fan base, surprisingly. Although, Constantine doesn't have the same visual charm that Underworld does. Albeit Constantine does don a black jacket. It makes up for it in the way that it tackles the demon hunter trope. This has more to do with the source material, of course, but Constantine takes lots of liberties in that regard as well, so it isn't necessarily a faithful adaptation. What I like about Constantine is that it knows what it is and doesn't pull any punches or try to downplay itself. But most importantly, it's just a good action movie with horror elements to spice it up. And that's where the heart of this video lies, ladies and gentlemen. The simplicity of the action genre with the visual appeal that comes with the horror genre. Obviously, like I said earlier, this is definitely a personal preference. But who doesn't like to see creatures and fiendish ghouls being riddled with bullet holes? I can only think of one instance in which these things could be so bad that even I wouldn't be able to watch it. The inevitability of a shitty movie. When the sun rises, it also has to set. And in the case of Van Helsing from 2004, it's not just the sun setting, but the sun exploding and killing us all. This is not an exaggeration. I genuinely hate this movie. I sat through it because I am in fact not of my right mind. I had to endure the cliche gender tropes, the shitty romance, the bad villain, and the forgettable score. Except for that one track that plays when there's a hero moment for Helsing. And also the set design is pretty good. It's funny because the shitty movie back then still had hours of labor poured into it to create a physical set. Well, the same thing happens today, but with green screens and with workers who don't have a union. Van Helsing is obviously a black spot for this subgenre, but unfortunately, it appears that making an even decent action horror movie is quite rare, and I don't understand why. Is it because these genres don't mix well with critics and audiences? Does the action movie crowd not want horror elements in their movies because they make the movies too muddy and dark? Does the horror crowd not like them because they are too highbrow and look down on action in general? Who knows? What I do know is that classics like The Crow from 1994 are only being recycled today into worse movies because the people making them don't want to commit to the aesthetic that made a movie like The Crow interesting in the first place. They like the idea but are scared or hesitant to make the movie the way it should look. For The Crow, as an example, the original movie was set in a grimy, dirty, and ugly city, which only emphasized the relationship between Draven and Shelley as something pure, while the trailers for the remake show something akin to modern-day New York or Chicago. I guess I should watch the movie, but I really don't want to, because why would I? When the visual aesthetic that comes with making a decent action horror movie is gone. Only having speckled dots of black ink on an otherwise white canvas. Broadly, visually boring, but with hints of personality here and there. I think that action horror is a genre that can be explored deeply to create visually entertaining movies that would have otherwise have been overlooked because they lack any charm, and that's a larger problem that the movie business faces today. Big studios want $1 gazillion in profit, so they play it super safe with movies that they make, which usually cost like $400 million. So the outcome is nothing interesting and original that's being made. Sure, you have the few exceptions, of course, but from production houses that specialize in smaller indie projects. And not my preferred situation of studios making lots of movies with smaller budgets and letting creative people create creative creations. A bit of a downer way to end the video, and I apologize. But I believe that the action horror genre really was a flash in the pan of a dying age of Hollywood. And I want to express my admiration for it, because I truly like the schlock that comes out of these movies. Go watch an action horror movie. I've been your host, Mr. Ramirez, live from the studio. And as always, goodbye.